The dissolution of the monasteries, sometimes referred to as the suppression of the monasteries, was the set of administrative and legal processes between 1536 and 1541 by which Henry VIII disbanded Catholic monasteries, priories, convents and friaries in England, Wales and Ireland, appropriated their income, disposed of their assets, and reassigned or dismissed the former members and functions. Although the policy was originally envisaged as increasing the regular income of the crown, much former monastic property was sold off to fund Henry's military campaigns in the 1540s. He was given the authority to do this in England and Wales by the Act of Supremacy, passed by Parliament in 1534, which made him supreme head of the Church in England, thus separating England from papal authority, and by the First Suppression Act and the Second Suppression Act. Professor George W. Bernard argues, the dissolution of the monasteries in the late 1530s was one of the most revolutionary events in English history. There were nearly 900 religious houses in England, around 260 for monks, 300 for regular canons, 142 nunneries and 183 friaries, some 12,000 people in total, 4,000 monks, 3,000 canons, 3,000 friars and 2,000 nuns. One adult man in 50 was in religious orders. In 1539, the property one of the monasteries that had been seized, St. Andrew's Priory, was sold off to Lawrence Washington, ancestor of the first United States President, George Washington. Context: at the time of the suppression, a small number of English and Welsh religious houses could trace their origins back to Anglo-Saxon or Celtic foundations before the Norman conquest, but the overwhelming majority of the 625 monastic communities dissolved by Henry VIII owed their existence to the wave of monastic enthusiasm that had swept Western Christendom in the 11th and 12th centuries. Very few English houses had been founded later than the end of the 13th century, the most recent foundation of those suppressed being the Brigittine Nunnery of Sion Abbey, founded in 1415. Typically, 11th and 12th century founders had endowed monastic houses with both temporal income in the form of revenues from landed estates, and spiritual income in the form of tithes appropriated from parish churches under the founder's patronage. In consequence of this, religious houses in the 16th century controlled appointment to about 2/5 of all parish benefices in England, disposed of about half of all ecclesiastical income, and owned around a quarter of the nation's landed wealth. The 200 houses of friars in England and Wales constituted a second distinct wave of foundations, almost all occurring in the 13th century. Friaries, for the most part, were concentrated in urban areas. Unlike monasteries, friaries had eschewed income-bearing endowments. The friars, as mendicants, looked to support themselves financially from offerings and donations from the faithful, while ideally being self-sufficient in basic foods from their extensive kitchen gardens. The dissolution of the monasteries in England and Ireland took place in the political context of other attacks on the ecclesiastical institutions of Western Roman Catholicism which had been underway for some time, many of them also underlying the Protestant Reformation in continental Europe. By the end of the 16th century, monasticism had almost entirely disappeared from those European states whose rulers had adopted Lutheran or Reformed confessions of faith, while remaining, albeit in greatly reduced numbers and radically changed forms, in those states that remained Catholic. However, the religious changes in England under Henry VIII and Edward VI were of a different nature from those taking place in and Germany, Bohemia, France, Scotland and Geneva. Across much of continental Europe, the seizure of monastic property was associated with mass discontent against powerful and wealthy ecclesiastical institutions among common people and the lower levels of clergy and civil society. Such popular hostility against the Church was rare in England before 1558. Consequently, the Reformation in England and Ireland was directed from the highest levels of society, but was initially met with widespread popular suspicion, spilling over, on some occasions and in particular localities, into active resistance, complaints, dissatisfaction with the general state of regular religious life, and with the gross extent of monastic wealth, was near to universal amongst late medieval secular and ecclesiastical rulers in the Latin West. Bernard says there was widespread concern in the later 15th and early 16th centuries about the condition of the monasteries. A leading figure here is the scholar and theologian Desiderius or Erasmus, who satirized monasteries as lax, as comfortably worldly, as wasteful of scarce resources, and as superstitious. He also thought it would be better if monks were brought more directly under the authority of bishops. At the time, quite a few bishops across Europe had come to believe that resources expensively deployed on an unceasing round of services by men and women in theory set apart from the world be better spent on endowing grammar schools and university colleges to train men who would then serve the laity as parish priests, and on reforming the antiquated structures of over-large dioceses such as that of Lincoln. Pastoral care was seen as much more important and vital than the monastic focus on contemplation, prayer and performance of the daily office. Or Erasmus's criticisms of the monks and nuns of his day were threefold: that, in withdrawing from the world into their own communal life, they elevated man-made monastic vows of poverty, chastity and obedience above the God-given vows of sacramental baptism, and elevated man-made monastic rules for religious life above the God-given teachings of the Gospels. That, notwithstanding exceptional communities of genuine austere life and exemplary charity, the overwhelming majority of abbeys and priories were havens for idle drones, concerned only for their own existence, reserving for themselves an excessive share of the Commonwealth's religious assets, and contributing little or nothing to the spiritual needs of ordinary people. That the monasteries, almost without exception, were heavily involved in promoting and profiting from the veneration of relics, in the form of pilgrimages and purported miraculous tokens. The cult of relics was by no means specific to monasteries, but Erasmus was scandalized by the extent to which well-educated and highly regarded monks and nuns would participate in the perpetration of obvious frauds against gullible and credulous lay believers. Summarizing the state of monastic life across Western Europe, David Knowles said, "The verdict of unprejudiced historians at the present day would probably be, abstracting from all ideological considerations for or against monasticism, that there were far too many religious houses in existence in view of the widespread decline of the fervent monastic vocation, and that in every country the monks possessed too much of wealth and of the sources of production both for their own well-being and for the material good of the economy." Knowles was himself a monk, and this factor may have predisposed him to a relatively harsh assessment of the quality of religious observance in English monasteries immediately before the dissolution, a negative assessment only exacerbated by, as Knowles saw it, the betrayal of the highest monastic ideals represented in the subscribing to the submission of the clergy and the royal supremacy. More recent scholarship tends towards a more positive view of the last years of English monasticism, emphasizing that the religious life in English monasteries was commonly better observed in England than in other European states, that there were a number of particular houses in the final years which seriously sought to raise standards of learning amongst the members and to spread religious teaching in the localities, that the majority of monks and nuns in England remained committed to continuing in the religious life right up to the point when it became clear this was no longer an option, and that there is strong evidence for popular support for the continuation of monasteries in all localities where they came under threat. English monasticism in the 1530s may have faced grave and urgent problems, but it was far from moribund. Reforms, pilgrimages to monastic shrines continued to be widely popular, until forcibly suppressed in England in 1538 by order of Henry VIII, but otherwise the dissolution resulted in few modifications to the practice of religion in England's parish churches. In general, the English religious reforms of the 1530s corresponded in few respects to the precepts of Protestant reformers, and encountered much popular hostility when they did. In 1536, Convocation adopted and Parliament enacted the 10 Articles, of which the first half utilized terminology and ideas drawn from Luther and Melanchthon, but any momentum towards Protestantism stalled when Henry VIII expressed his desire for continued orthodoxy with the 6 Articles of 1539, which remained in effect until after his death. Cardinal Wolsey had obtained a papal bull from the Pope, authorizing some limited reforms in the English Church as early as 1518, but reformers had become increasingly frustrated at the lack of progress. Henry wanted to change this, and in November 1529 Parliament passed acts reforming apparent abuses in the English Church. They set a cap on fees, both for the probate of wills and mortuary expenses for burial in hallowed ground, tightened regulations covering rights of sanctuary for criminals, and reduced to 2 the number of church benefices that could in future be held by one man. These acts sought to demonstrate that establishing royal jurisdiction over the Church would ensure progress in religious reformation where papal authority had been insufficient. The monasteries were next in line. J. Scase-Brigg remarked in his biography of Henry VIII, "Suffice it to say that English monasticism was a huge and urgent problem, that radical action, though of precisely what kind was another matter, was both necessarily and inevitable, and that a purge of the religious orders was probably regarded as the most obvious task of the new regime, as the first function of a supreme head, empowered by statute to visit, extirp and redress the stories of monastic impropriety, vice and excess that were to be collected by Thomas Cromwell's visitors may have been biased and exaggerated. Nevertheless, the religious houses of England and Wales, with the notable exceptions of those of the Carthusians, the observant Franciscans, and the Brigittine nuns and monks, had long ceased to play a leading role in the spiritual life of the country, and other than in these 3 orders, observance of strict monastic rules was partial at best. The exceptional spiritual discipline of the Carthusian, observant Franciscan and Brigittine orders had, over the previous century, resulted in the being singled out for royal favor, in particular with houses benefiting from endowments confiscated by the crown from the suppressed alien priories. Otherwise, in this latter period, donations and legacies had tended to go instead towards parish churches, university colleges, grammar schools and collegiate churches, which suggests greater public approbation of such purposes. Levels of of monastic debt were increasing, and average numbers of professed religious were falling, although the monasteries did continue to attract recruits right up to the end. Only a few monks and nuns lived in conspicuous luxury, but most were very comfortably fed and housed by the standards of the time, and few any longer set standards of ascetic piety or religious observance. Only a minority of houses could now support the 12 or 13 professed religious usually regarded as the minimum necessary to maintain the full canonical hours of the divine office. Even in houses with adequate numbers, the regular obligations of communal eating and shared living had not been fully enforced for centuries, as communities tended to subdivide into a number of distinct familia. In most larger houses, the full observance of the canonical hours had become the task of a subgroup of cloister monks, such that the majority of the professed members of the house were freed to conduct the business and live much of their lives in the secular world. Extensive monastic complexes dominated English towns of any size, but most were less than half full. Nor was it insignificant that Cromwell and Henry, from 1534 onwards, were constantly seeking for ways to redirect ecclesiastical income to the benefit of the crown, efforts though justified by contending that much ecclesiastical revenue had been improperly diverted from royal resources in the first place. Renaissance princes throughout Europe were facing severe financial difficulties due to sharply rising expenditures, especially to pay for armies, fighting ships and fortifications. Most tended, sooner or later, to resort to plundering monastic wealth, and to increasing taxation on the clergy. Protestant princes would justify this by claiming divine authority. Catholic princes would obtain the agreement and connivance of the papacy. Monastic wealth, regarded everywhere as excessive and idle, offered a standing temptation for cash-strapped secular and ecclesiastical authorities. In consequence, almost all official action in respect of the dissolution in England and Wales was directed at the monasteries and monastic property. It was monastic closures that aroused popular opposition, and recalcitrant monasteries and abbots who became the targets of royal hostility. The surrender of the friaries, from an official perspective, arose almost as an afterthought, as an exercise in administrative tidiness once it had been determined that all religious houses would have to go. In terms of popular esteem, however, the balance tilted the other way. Almost all monasteries supported themselves from their endowments, unless they were notably bad landlords or scandalously neglected parish churches. In the charge, they tended to enjoy widespread local support, particularly as they commonly appointed local notables to fee-bearing offices. The friars, by contrast, were much more likely to have been the objects of local hostility, especially since the practice of soliciting income through legacies appears often to have been perceived as diminishing anticipated family inheritances. English precedents of the Church. By the time Henry VIII turned his mind to the business of monastery reform, royal action to suppress religious houses had a history stretching back more than 200 years. The first case was that of the so-called alien priories. As a result of the Norman conquests, the French religious orders held substantial property through the daughter monasteries in England. Some of these were merely granges, agricultural estates with a single foreign monk in residence to supervise things. Others were rich foundations in their own right. Owing to the fairly constant state of war between England and France in the late Middle Ages, successive English governments had objected to money going overseas to France from these alien priories where the French king might get hold of it, and to foreign prelates having jurisdiction over English monasteries. Furthermore, after 1378, French monasteries maintained allegiance to the continuing Avignon papacy, and so the suppression was supported by the rival Roman popes, conditional on all confiscated monastic property eventually being redirected into other religious uses. The king's offices first sequestrated the assets of the alien priories in 1295 to 1303 under Edward I, and the same thing happened repeatedly for long periods over the course of the 14th century, most particularly in the reign of Edward III. Those alien priories that had functioning communities were forced to pay large sums to the king, while those that were mere estates were confiscated and run by royal offices, the proceeds going to the king's pocket. Such estates were a valuable source of income for the crown in its French wars. Most of the larger alien priories were allowed to become naturalized on payment of heavy fines and bribes, but for around 90 smaller houses and granges the fates were sealed when Henry V dissolved them by Act of Parliament in 1414. The properties went to the crown. Some were kept, some were subsequently given or sold to Henry's supporters. Others went to his new monasteries of Sion Abbey and the Carthusians at Sheen Priory. Others went to educational purposes. All these suppressions enjoyed papal approval, though successive 15th-century popes continued to press for assurances that, now that the Avignon papacy had been defeated, the confiscated monastic income would revert to religious and educational uses. It was fundamental to the medieval understanding of religious houses as institutions that monasteries and nunneries were identified with the property, that is to say, their endowments of land and spiritual income, and not with the current personnel of monks and nuns. If the property with which a house had been endowed by its founder were to be confiscated or surrendered, then the house ceased to exist, whether its members continued in the religious life or not. Consequently, the founder and their heirs had a continuing interest in certain aspects of the house's functioning. The nomination was required at the election of an abbot or prior. They could claim hospitality within the house when needed, and they could be buried within the house when they died. In addition, though this scarcely ever happened, the endowments of the house would revert to the founder's heirs if the community failed or dissolved. The status of founder was considered in civil law to be real property, and could consequently be bought and sold, in which case the purchaser would be termed the patron. Furthermore, like any other real property, in intestacy and some other circumstances the status of founder would revert to the crown, a procedure that many houses actively sought, as it might be advantageous in the legal dealings in the king's courts. The founders of the alien priories had been foreign monasteries refusing allegiance to the English crown, and these property rights were therefore automatically forfeited to the crown when their English dependencies were dissolved by Act of Parliament. But the example created by these events prompted questions as to what action might be taken should houses of English foundation cease for any reason to exist. Much would depend on who, at the time the house ended, held the status of founder or patron, and, as with other such disputes in real property, the standard procedure was to empanel a jury to decide between disputing claimants. In practice, the crown claimed the status of founder in all such cases that occurred. Consequently, when a monastic community failed, the bishop would seek to obtain papal approval for alternative use of the house's endowments in canon law, and this, with royal agreement claiming foundership, would then be presented to an impaneled jury for consent to disposal of the property of the house in civil law. The royal transfer of alien monastic estates to educational foundations proved an inspiration to the bishops, and as the 15th century waned, such moves became more and more common. The subjects of these dissolutions were usually small, poor and indebted Benedictine or Augustinian communities with few powerful faithful friends, the great abbeys and orders exempt from diocesan supervision, such as the Cistercians, were unaffected. The consequent new foundations were most often Oxford University and Cambridge University colleges. Instances of this include John Alcock, Bishop of Ely, dissolving the Benedictine nunnery of St Radigan to found Jesus College, Cambridge, and William Waynflete, Bishop of Winchester, acquiring Selborne Priory in 1484 for Magdalen College, Oxford. In the following century, Lady Margaret Beaufort obtained the property of Creek Abbey to fund her works at Oxford and Cambridge, an action she took on the advice of such a staunch traditionalist as John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester. In 1522, Fisher himself is also found dissolving the women's monasteries of Bromhall and Higham to aid St John's College, Cambridge. That same year, Cardinal Wolsey dissolved St Friaries Priory to form the basis of his Christchurch, Oxford. In 1524, he secured a papal bull to dissolve some 20 other monasteries to provide an endowment for his new college. In all these suppressions, the remaining friars, monks and nuns were absorbed into other houses of the respective orders, and juries found the property of the house to have reverted to the crown. As founder, the conventional wisdom of the time was that the proper daily observance of the divine office of prayer required a minimum of 12 professed religious, but by the 1530s only a minority of religious houses in England could provide this, and accordingly most observers were agreed that a systematic reform of the English Church must necessarily involve the drastic concentration of monks and nuns into fewer, larger houses, potentially making much monastic income available for more productive religious, educational and social purposes. But what may have represented a consensus in general principle are often faced strong resistance in practice. Members of religious houses proposed for dissolution might resist relocation, the houses invited to receive them might refuse to cooperate, and local notables might resist the disruption in the networks of influence. Moreover, reforming bishops found they faced intractable opposition when urging the heads of religious houses to enforce rigorous observation of their monastic rules, especially in respect of requiring monks and nuns to remain within their cloisters. Monks and nuns in almost all late medieval English religious communities, although theoretically living in religious poverty, were nevertheless paid an annual cash wage and were in receipt of other regular cash rewards and pittances, which accorded considerable effective freedom from claustral rules for those disinclined to be restricted by them. Religious superiors met the bishop's pressure with the response that the austere and cloistered ideal was no longer acceptable to more than a tiny minority of regular clergy, and that any attempt on the part to enforce their order's stricter rules could be overturned in counter-actions in the secular courts. For aggrieved monks and nuns to obtain a writ of praemunire, the king actively supported Wolsey, Fisher and Richard Fox in the programs of monastic reform, but even so, progress was painfully slow, especially where religious orders had been exempted from episcopal oversight by papal authority. Moreover, it was by no means certain that juries would always find in favor of the crown in disposing of the property of dissolved houses. Any action that impinged on monasteries with substantial assets might be expected to be contested by a range of influential claimants. In 1532, the Priory of Christchurch, Aldgate, facing financial and legal difficulties, petitioned the king as founder for assistance, only to find themselves dissolved willy-nilly, rather than risk impaneling a jury, and with papal participation at this juncture no longer being welcome, the Lord Chancellor, Thomas Audley, recommended that dissolution should be legalized retrospectively through a special Act of Parliament.